Hello and welcome to Train Signal. This is video number 1, Introduction to Linux. This is part of Train Signal Fast Track CBT video covering Linux networking and administration. Here's our table of contents for this video. This will be a short introduction video. We're going to learn about what is Linux anyway. What's the history of Linux? Where did Linux come from? What are the different types of Linux? Linux versus Unix, a comparison of Linux versus Windows, and then the strengths and weaknesses of Linux. So first off, what is Linux? Well, Linux is an operating system. So an operating system is the foundation for all other software you run on a computer. So an operating system is software you load on a computer, and that allows you to run other applications. So Linux could be compared to Windows XP or Windows Server 2003. It's an operating system you load to allow you to run other Linux applications. Linux is a clone of Unix operating systems, but unlike many versions of Unix, most versions of Linux are free. So what that means is most versions of Unix are commercial and you have to pay to use Unix. Also, most versions of Unix are designed to run on large mini computers, whereas Linux was designed to run on a PC. Now that doesn't mean that Linux doesn't run on servers. In fact, it does, and it makes a great server operating system. But Linux was originally designed to run on a PC. Now Linux is a multitasking and multi-user operating system. So what that means is you can run multiple programs on Linux at the same time, and you can have multiple users using the same Linux computer at the same time. So, for instance, Windows Server was designed to do this, but Windows XP really isn't designed to be a multi-user operating system. I mean, it can multitask, but typically you don't find multiple users using a Windows computer all at the same time. Whereas with Linux, this is fairly common, and that's what it was designed to do. Linux is robust and scalable, so you can take the same CD installation of Linux and run it on a laptop, and also take the same CD and run it on a large multiprocessor server with many gigabytes of RAM. So it's the same operating system no matter what you run it on. So it's robust and scalable, meaning it can scale from the laptop all the way up to the server. Linux is stable. It's known for being a stable operating system, not crashing. Linux can crash, of course, just like any operating system can, but it's known for being a very stable operating system that doesn't have a lot of operating system crashes. Linux is growing in popularity, and as an example to that, I point out that Apache is the #1 web server on the internet today, and those Apache web servers run on Linux servers. So Linux is really the operating system that most web servers on the internet run today. Linux is open source, as are most applications available for it. So you can get the actual source for the operating system, and you can modify it however you want if you're a programmer, if you're inclined to do that. Same thing for the applications that you download and install in Linux. Usually you can get the source code freely available for those applications, and you could modify them however you want. So you have that flexibility and that power with Linux. Linux is portable, meaning you can run Linux on PDAs, cell phones, inside cars. They're using it for navigation systems. You can run it. There's a lot of dedicated appliances out there, and when I say appliances, I'm not talking about your toaster or anything, but I wouldn't be surprised if Linux was running on someone's fancy refrigerator that had some sort of computer built into it. It's just amazing everything that they're able to do with Linux, and part of that is due to the source code being freely available. The developers of those products can take that source code, shrink it down, just use the pieces of Linux that they need, and install it on that device, that they're designing to sell to the consumer. Linux is secure, so there aren't a lot of patches or viruses that come out for Linux. Linux is a fairly secure operating system. Now, of course, there are patches, and you'll have to update your Linux system with those patches, but there's not a flood of patches that usually come out for Linux. So we learned about what is Linux. Let's learn about the history of Linux. Now, here's a little bit of the history of Linux, just to give you sort of an overview summary of where Linux came from. Back in 1991, a guy named Linus Torvalds was a student at the University of Helsinki in Finland. He developed the Linux kernel. Now, the Linux kernel isn't what you think of when you think of Linux today. And as you'll see in this series of videos, Linux is a graphical operating system. It also has a very strong and robust command line, and there's a lot of different applications and utilities. But normally you don't think about the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel is sort of the core of the operating system. It's the rules behind the operating system. It's what makes Linux a multi-user, multitasking operating system. So it's the core. It's what makes Linux tick. So he developed this Linux kernel, and he made it freely available for download on the internet. Now, with just a kernel, you really can't do very much. To most people, the average user, the Linux kernel by itself isn't very useful. I did read a quote from Linus where he said one of the best things he ever did was making that Linux kernel freely available for download on the internet. Now, back in 1983, the Free Software Foundation there at fsf.org, they began developing an open source software that was going to create a free Unix operating system. Now, this software was called the GNU Utilities, where GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix. So it's GNU or GNU. Now, this GNU software, these utilities, were the applications or the things that you normally think about when you think of an operating system. Maybe the graphical desktop, the little applications, the little utilities you use. These are the GNU utilities. Now, what the GNU operating system didn't have yet was a kernel. So around 1991, these GNU utilities were combined with the Linux kernel to make GNU Linux. Today, most people call this operating system Linux. However, the Free Software Foundation says that this is incorrect and it should be called GNU Linux. This debate over the naming of the product is detailed in the Wikipedia here at this link, where they go into great detail about the debate over what Linux should really be called. Now, I think popularity has won out, and most people today just call it Linux. Now, you should know that the Linux source code and most applications for it are free of charge. So any company charging you for Linux is not charging you for the software, but instead they're charging you for compiling the software, for a certain hardware platform, for packaging the software, putting it on CDs and putting it in a box and shipping it to you, and for the support of the software. So if you have a question, you can call them. Also, some companies do their own patches for Linux. So they'll give you a patch for some sort of security hole. They also do testing to make sure that applications are stable and applications, work with other applications and so forth. So, for instance, with Red Hat, originally they were distributing Linux for free. And what they've recently done is they've broken off Linux into two separate versions. One is called Fedora, and Fedora is free. It's sort of the cutting edge. It's sort of the beta software. No support is offered through Red Hat. Of course, you can get support, through the generosity of people on the internet, but there's no real paid support for Fedora. And then they have what they call Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you have to buy and pay for, and when you do that, you get support. Support is mandatory. In fact, you have to buy support. You get patches, maintenance updates, and of course the packaging and the download of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So there's a variety of companies on the internet that will sell you Linux, but you just have to be careful to really make sure what it is you're buying, because you're not buying the software, you're buying something else. I was talking about the debate between whether Linux should be called Linux or GNU Linux. And to symbolize that debate, there's two different icons. The first one here is the GNU. The GNU represents the GNU Linux camp, and that's what they think Linux should be called. So they've got their little GNU icon here. Down here is the Tux. Tux represents Linux. So the people who think it should be called Linux, they have their little icon here, Tux. They're mascots, if you will. Now, when Red Hat released its fully packaged version of Linux with support, the popularity of Linux took off. Soon after that, commercial vendors like IBM, Dell, and HP began pushing Linux on their servers. Linux continues to increase in popularity more and more with mainstream computer users. In 2002, it was calculated that about 25% of servers and 2.8% of desktops run Linux. So this number increases every year, and more servers and more desktops continue to start using Linux as their operating system. Now let's talk about important Linux licensing information. Linux is the most important part of the open source software movement. Linux is legally covered by the GNU General Public License, also known as the GPL, and you'll see a lot of different software that's covered by this license. Open source software is free, but it's not in the public domain. It's not shareware either. GPL allows people to take free software and distribute their own versions of the software. However, the vendors who sell free software cannot restrict the rights of users who purchase the software. In other words, users who buy GPL software can make copies of it and distribute it free of charge or for a fee. Also, distributors of GPL software must make it clear that the software is covered by the GPL and must provide the complete source code for the software at no cost. Linux is the perfect example of how this is supposed to work. So we learned a little bit about the history of Linux, how it came to be, the two different camps of Linux. Now let's talk about the different types of Linux. So first off, let's talk about Linux distributions. A Linux distribution is a precompiled and prepackaged version of Linux. It may offer certain features and software applications that other distributions do not. There are over 300 different Linux distributions. This can be a bit overwhelming, and this is because of that GPL license where anyone can take Linux source code, recompile it, make their own Linux distribution. Some of the most popular Linux distributions are Red Hat Linux, be it Fedora or Enterprise Linux, Debian, SUSE, which is actually Novell, and Gentoo. Now, a Linux clone is a Linux version based on a certain distribution. For example, CentOS and Whitebox Enterprise Linux, to name a couple, take the Red Hat Enterprise Linux source code and recompile it. This way, users get the stability and benefits of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but at no cost. If you'll remember before, I talked about how Red Hat took two paths and they offered Fedora, which is the free version of their Linux software. However, Fedora is sort of a beta version. It's like the cutting edge version of Linux. Then they have Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is a more stable and more tested version of Enterprise Linux. And what they do is they charge you for that version of Enterprise Linux because they're testing it, they offer the support and everything. But because of the GPL license, they also have to offer the source code for the version they're charging for, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. They have to offer that source code available at no cost for download on the internet. Now, if you're a savvy user, you can take that source code and you can compile your own version of Enterprise Linux and run it at no cost. But it takes some work to do that. So what these other companies are doing, CentOS and Whitebox Enterprise Linux, they're compiling it for you and then they're making it available for download on the internet. I mean, can you imagine if Windows XP source code was freely available on the internet and you could just take it and compile it and use it at no cost, or you could modify it and do whatever you wanted to do with it? it would be amazing. And it truly is amazing that Linux is just freely available for download on the internet. You can get the source code, modify it, do whatever you want to do with it. So that's what has spawned all these different types of Linux, the distributions, the clones, all the different versions. It's truly amazing. So now let's talk about Linux versus Unix. There's a lot of confusion on the difference between Linux and Unix. Linux is a Unix-like operating system, and I say that because Unix was the original. Unix was around first. So Linux is like Unix. It's based on Unix. Unix is the original. Unix is broken down into System 5 Unix and BSD Unix. There is something on the internet called FreeBSD. You can get free Unix available on the internet called FreeBSD. Now, most versions of System 5 Unix are commercial versions of Unix, and some versions of BSD Unix are also commercial Unix. Unix is typically run on larger mini computers and distributed through commercial variants like IBM's AIX and Sun Solaris. So obviously you have to pay for these versions of Unix, and you're paying for the hardware typically that these versions of Unix run on. You're paying for support, maintenance contracts, everything. So it's a very expensive undertaking to run most of these versions of Unix when you compare it to running Linux. Linux is made for PCs and lower-end servers. And Linux is a type of Unix. That's the thing that you need to keep in mind, is Linux is a type of Unix. So now let's move on to a comparison. A comparison of Linux versus Windows. So first off, let's start with the strengths of Windows. In general, Windows has better support. Now, that's controversial. That's debatable, you know. How good a support does Microsoft really offer? Well, you can get support directly from Microsoft. You could get it through some other company that's supporting Windows. You can get Windows support through a lot of different sources. But in general, there is a lot of support for Windows, and that's mainly because it's so darn popular. So many people use Windows, so many companies use Windows, and because of that, you know, Windows gets hammered on a lot, it gets tested, it gets run, people find the bugs very quickly, and there's fixes for those bugs out on the internet. Of course, it's not perfect, but it does have a lot of support. There's more software available for Windows. Windows being the most popular operating system available, of course, that's what most people are going to write software for. So there's a lot of software available for Windows. Windows is easier for new users to use. So if someone has never used a computer, they sit down, they go to run Windows, it's going to be more intuitive, it's going to be more user-friendly than running Linux. Now, it's not the easiest thing. You know, a lot of people who use Macintosh OS or Mac OS say that that's the easiest operating system. And that very well may be true. And in fact, Mac OS X is actually is a version of Linux. There's debate to all these strengths and weaknesses of Windows and of Linux, but there's no denying that Windows, because it's the most popular operating system out there, there are certain strengths that come along with being the most popular operating system. One of them is that Windows has a professional and commercial development team. So there's thousands of developers that work at Microsoft. They're paid a lot of money to work every day and make sure that Windows is continually improved. It's more easy to use. It's more stable. They improve the applications that are in it. They add new applications. So that's a tremendous strength of Windows. In comparison, Linux really doesn't have a commercial development team. People who work on Linux and enhance it are usually not paid anything, and they're freely donating their time to improve an operating system that they think is really cool, and they want to help make a difference by helping to improve Linux. Now, another strength of Windows, and this is debatable again, that people say because it's closed source, it's more secure. So because you can't see how Windows does certain things, you can't see how the networking portion of Windows works, people say that that makes it more secure, meaning hackers can't understand how Windows works and what holes might be in the Windows operating system. Because they can't see that, they can't write a virus or a worm to exploit it. This is true, to some extent, but it's not completely true. On the other hand, Linux is open source, and anyone can write a virus for it because they can see the holes that are out there. However, there's not a lot of holes out there. So there's not a lot of viruses written for Linux. And other people say that that's because virus writers just don't have any interest in exploiting Linux because it's not used as much. So you can go back and forth on this. But anyway, Windows source is not available for download, and you can't see the Windows source. And to some degree, this might make it more secure. Now on to Windows weaknesses. Because of Windows popularity, it is the target. So anytime there's a virus written, the first operating system people are going to write it for is Windows. People are going to pick on Windows. They're going to try to exploit Windows and try to make it look bad, make it look unstable, talk about how it crashes all the time. It's going to be the brunt of all the jokes. It's going to be the brunt of all the criticism. Another Windows weakness is its closed source makes modification difficult. So if I want to run Windows on some specialized device, or I want to do something crazy with Windows, usually I can't because I can't get access to the source. Another weakness of Windows is the cost. Of course, you have to pay for Windows. Windows costs money. Linux, on the other hand, is typically free. Windows also has stability problems. Because there's so many different drivers for Windows, there's so many different applications, making all these things work together is a tremendous challenge. Linux, on the other hand, usually doesn't have as much of a problem with this because there's not as many applications, there's not as many drivers. It's more open, and things fit together a little bit better, but also there's not as many things to have to fit together. Windows has a big problem with this. There's so many things to try to make work all together, and in doing that, Windows has stability problems. So we learned about the strengths and weaknesses of Windows. Now let's learn about the strengths and weaknesses of Linux. And of course, some of the weaknesses of Windows are going to be the strengths of Linux. Some of the strengths of Windows are going to be the weaknesses of Linux. The first strength of Linux I have down is that open source makes it more secure. We said under Windows, one of the strengths of Windows was that closed source makes it more secure. So you can see why I say this is debatable. With open source software, people say that because the source is freely available, it's been tested more. All the holes have already been found for it because everyone has seen what it can do. Everyone has seen how it works. And because they know how it works, the holes have already been found, and there aren't many holes left. Whereas with Windows, people say, hey, there could be a lot of holes in there. We just haven't seen the source to see how it really works. But we'll find them eventually through trial and error. The next strength of Linux is it costs less, or it's free. Next thing is most applications are free. So there's a lot of freeness when it comes to Linux. Linux is highly portable. You can use it on all different types of devices. It's highly customizable. You can modify the source however you want, cut things out, add things in, make your own operating system, whatever you want to do. And I put down that Linux is the networking OS. Linux was originally designed to work on large mini computers that were on networks, on the internet, communicating, multi-user, multitasking. So Linux has a strong history of doing this, just like Unix does. Windows, on the other hand, has a history of being a single-user operating system, just running on a PC. So to me, that is a strength of Linux. Now, the weaknesses of Linux is that it can be challenging to learn how to use. I know this from my own experience. Linux can be downright frustrating sometimes. Of course, Windows can be frustrating too, but I think Linux is much more frustrating in some cases when you're learning how to use it, because it doesn't always behave in a friendly way. Things don't always work how you would expect them to work in Windows, because Windows has been made so easy to use and user-friendly over the years. It can be difficult to install applications and patches on Linux. You know, on Windows we're used to just automatic update. You click install and it installs and reboots and you're done. On Windows you're also used to being able to download any program on the internet. It's called setup.exe. You run it, you install it, and 2 minutes later you're using this new application. Well, on Linux this can be difficult. Patches, just to patch an FTP server, let's say on Unix, you might have to download the new source code, recompile it. Maybe you're missing a library. You have to download a library, an updated library, then recompile, put the new application in place. So it can be a lot more work to install applications and new versions of applications. Another Linux weakness is that devices are not always supported, especially on things like laptops, where you have specialized devices and specialized ports. These can be difficult to support and use Linux on devices like laptops. Another thing is that applications aren't always available. A lot of times on Linux you don't have a lot of choices. Say you want to run a financial application to do your budget in Windows. You might have 12 or more choices to choose from on Windows. On Linux, you might have one. It's GNU Cache is the only financial application to do your home budget on Linux. So there aren't as many applications, and they're not always as available as they are on Windows. So in conclusion, on this video, we learned what is Linux. We learned what Linux is an operating system. It's a strong, robust, stable, and secure operating system. It's what you install on your computer to allow you to run other Linux applications. We learned the history of Linux and how Linus wrote the kernel, and then these GNU utilities came along. They were combined together to make this GNU Linux, which today is primarily called just Linux. We learned about the different types of Linux, how there's distributions and there's clones. We learned about the difference between Linux and Unix. Linux was designed to run on PCs primarily, and Unix was primarily designed to run on larger mini-computers. We compared Linux versus Windows. We learned the strengths and weaknesses of Windows and the strengths and weaknesses of Linux. We learned about how Windows is commercial. Of course, it costs money. It's the most popular operating system, but it also has some stability problems. It can have some security problems because it's the target of all the virus writers and of the people trying to find holes in it. We learned how Linux is free and it's designed to run on PCs. It's stable. It's gaining in popularity, and the source is all free. You can take it, modify the source. You can download applications, which are usually free, and you can get the source code for those. The downside to Linux is that it can sometimes be difficult to learn how to use. Applications might not always be available, and drivers might not always be available. So this is the end of video number 1. This has been an introduction to Linux. Thank you very much.